The Grand Prix car, like a fighter aircraft, represents the pinnacle of the technology of its time and that of the country of origin. For a decade following the Second World War, Italian cars were supreme. The Alfa Romeo 158, whose straight-eight supercharged engine made it for a time unbeatable. The post-war years are now seen as a classic era, dominated by the blood-red cars of Italy, Alfa Romeo, Maserati, and a newcomer, Ferrari. From 1946, Italian racing cars, alive with nervous power, burst onto the tracks of Europe as if the war had never occurred. It is said that motor racing took place in southern Italy even as the war raged on in the north. The first official races took place in France, in Paris and at Nice. No one cared to question from where the fuel, tyres, and in certain cases, the cars themselves came from. The field included a 1925 Amel car. At Nice, the Italian Villoresi won on a Maserati. In England, too, cars were being disinterred from garage and barn, having survived bombs and wartime scrap drives. It had been hoped to run a victory race round Hyde Park, but the police had objected. The best that could be organised was a sprint meeting on Elstree Airfield. With pre-war English drivers like John Bolster and journalist Dennis Jenkinson competing, as did Lightweight, a car designed and built to test certain theories about rubber suspension. Its designer's later cars were to be better known, the Morris Minor and the Mini. Lightweight's young driver is Alec Isigonis. The reason for British drivers being reduced to an airfield was simple. Public roads in England could not by law be closed for motor racing. Before the war, racing had been at Brooklands, where the official motto was the right crowd and no crowding. The racing was almost incidental. During the war, Vickers had built bombers at Brooklands, and the track had been camouflaged and built upon, not only by fake houses, but solid buildings. And as a contemporary newsreel put it,
"No, I'm afraid there's no doubt about it. Brooklands has had it."
As had Donington, where the cars of Hitler's Germany had thrilled the crowds before the war. So if in 1946 you wished to see the works team of 158 Alfa Romeos in action, you had to journey to the continent. In this case, to Geneva, for what was the first post-war Grand Prix to Formula One. 1.5-litre supercharged, 4.5-litre unsupercharged. The Alfas outclass all other cars, taking first, second and third places. Nina Farina driving the winning car with Jean-Pierre Vimy second. Farina would enjoy many victories at the wheel of an Alfa 158, which had first appeared in 1938 to compete in voiturette races, equivalent to today's Formula 2. The cars had spent the war years walled up in a cheese factory. Now they are eligible for the new Formula 1. But who apart from Farina to drive them? Vimy died practicing at Buenos Aires. Achille Varze made a fatal mistake at Bern. Tazio Nuvolari, to this day considered by many to be the greatest driver of all time, was seriously ill, poisoned by years of breathing exhaust gas and corrosive fuels. Though developing a new car, he had driven in his last Grand Prix. A new generation takes over, one of whom is an Argentinian mechanic, Juan Manuel Fangio, El Chueco, the bow-legged one. Admirers from his hometown of Valcarce have given him a 4CLT Maserati, with which he wins at San Remo, Po and Perpignan. And though 38, he is signed by Alfa Romeo. By 1948, the lack of a racing circuit in Britain appeared to have been resolved. The RAC had visited many of the hundreds of abandoned wartime airfields attracted by the perimeter tracks and long runways. Also, most were isolated from articulate objectors to noise. One was leased, its name Silverstone. The first meeting there was in September for Formula 3, and followed by a Grand Prix to the new Formula One. Italian and French cars dominated, the best British cars being the supercharged ERAs. ERA, English Racing Automobiles, had first appeared in 1934 as voiturettes waiting on the sidelines for the real Grand Prix. Raymond May's centre was the father of the project, and pre-war ERAs had been very successful. But at Silverstone in 1948 they are outclassed by more modern continental cars, a travelling Marshall on a Norton. There were no Alfas at this meeting, which was won by Luigi Villaresi driving a Maserati. Another Italian, Alberto Ascari, was second on a similar car, and an ERA third. In September 1948, another airfield, West Hampnet, renamed Goodwood, was opened for racing. ERAs, driven with varying degrees of competence, competed. Yet, despite their archaic appearance, even then they went surprisingly well. John Watson tests an ERA, appropriately on a disused airfield.
It sums up for me what a racing engine should feel like and sound like, and it's just so eager and willing, wants to rev. I mean, it's lovely. I mean, it's so much fun. You're really sitting quite high on the car. It's a solid axle front and rear. The ride is very, very bouncy. Although the handling and road holding is not bad, it's just that you're driving along and I don't know what bounces more, the car or the driver, and there's nothing to hold you in, there's no seat belts. I think those drivers were different to the current Grand Prix driver. They weren't any better, but certainly it was a different form of racing. You couldn't drive a Grand Prix in those days as you would drive it today.
In the early post-war years, 16 surviving ERAs were the only Grand Prix cars available to most British drivers.
Heaven help them. I mean, the engine in the car, the engine in the ERA is absolutely fantastic. There's just something about the noise, the way it responds to the throttle. It sounds and feels like a real racing engine. But the suspension of the pre-war car is something that I have to take off my metaphorical hat, because it's beyond my conception how anybody, or how the guys that raced them, even in the early post-war years, were so successful.
And strong too, neither Jeff Ansell nor his ERA being seriously damaged. ERAs were eligible for Formula One races, though outclassed by Italian cars, in particular the Alfa 158s. The Alfa had been designed in 1938 by Colombo, who, like many Italian engineers, seemed able to turn artifact into art. The whole car was beautifully constructed. The 1.5-litre straight-eight supercharged engine produced 380 horsepower, at the cost of horrendous fuel consumption, 1.5 miles per gallon. But in the late 40s, the Alfa was the car to beat. A new British contender was revealed in 1949, the BRM, British Racing Motors. The successor to ERA, it too was the brainchild of Raymond Mays.
The plan is to restore British racing prestige all over the world, and it's hoped that the new BRM will be in action during 1950.
The BRM certainly looked and sounded impressive, with its very complex 16-cylinder supercharged engine. In 1950, huge crowds, over 100,000 expectant enthusiasts, turned up, queued up, and trudged to Silverstone for the British Grand Prix, the first race for the newly instigated Drivers' World Championship. Tens of thousands of the new motor racing public, many ex-servicemen, who found the sport an exciting release from the drab austerity of the times. Tea and wads for the groundlings. But the old Brooklands traditions were not quite submerged in the flood tide of popularity. With the right credentials, the right crowd was still distinctly uncrowded. Earl Howe reminisces with former Brooklands habitués in the enclosure. While 6 deep around the windswept circuit, the less favoured patiently wait. The King and Queen arrive, the first visit by a reigning British monarch to a motor race. Princess Margaret, too. The long-awaited BRM also arrived, not to race, but to be inspected by the royal guests in a tent. In the paddock, the Continental Grand Prix cars. The only British opposition, BRM still lurking in the tent, an ERA to be driven by Bob Gerard, seen here with his wife Joan, and a British Alta of 1939, the Swiss Baron de Graffenried, and a Siamese Prince, Bera, both to drive Maseratis. But, prince or commoner, they have little chance against the all-conquering Alphas in competition for the glittering prizes, which totals just £1,750. One British car which does make it to the track is the Sunbeam Talbot, which closes the course. And the first round of the 1950 Drivers' World Championship begins. In 1950, there is no safety road for the pits, so everyone hurries to clear the track. Straw bales, not Armco, guard the corners. The fast hangar straight, with the original hangars still evident. Evident, too, the superiority of the Alphas. In the pits, an overheated Maserati comes in. It has its supercharger pressure raised to try to keep up with the Alphas. Water in, water out. Its race is run. The lone Alta, driven by the Irishman Kelly, comes in for a leisurely refuel. Dr. Giuseppe Farina, relaxed and polished, leads the race. Filmed by Paul Wyand of Movietone, who captures the driving techniques of the time. Farina wins on the Alfa. Like many drivers of the time, Farina wears only a linen cap. When crash helmets are made compulsory, it is the drivers who object.
I remember how difficult it was to make the helmet compulsory. For instance, Nino Farina was, when it didn't like it at all. And then he was very thankful to have won when in the circuit of Turin he flew out and it was saved only by the helmet. And there was once in the Monza Grand Prix, there was a Fangio, Farina and Bonetto with these cars starting on the first line, and they refused to start with the helmet. And we had to, the last moment, to penalize them or something. We couldn't, of course, send them out. And that was one of the things. And the safety, well, we said the organizer gives you a track. You must go as fast as you can on the track. If you go out, it's your fault. And so, well, guardrails didn't exist, being tied down into cars didn't exist, roll bars, nothing of the sort. And our cars were not as low as they are today. And so when you were slipping out, as I did at the Crystal Palace, the car was overturning and you were pinned underneath.
Later, in 1950, the Alphas returned. Fangio was driving one against a 1.5-litre Ferrari and a single BRM which arrived too late to practice, so its driver Raymond Sommer had to complete a special lap to qualify. Which meant a start from the back row of the grid. Even so, expectations soared to fever pitch, and the revs rose as the flag fell. Sommer let in the clutch, and the transmission sheared. And that was the BRM's total involvement in the 1950 Silverstone Daily Express Trophy, leaving the field clear for the all-conquering Italian Alphas. As the BRM was wheeled ignominiously away, people jeered and threw pennies at it, watched by a teenage Sterling Moss, who was driving a Formula 2 HWM. HWM stood for Hesham and Walton Motors, a garage in Surrey. The cars were built there on a shoestring by John Heath and George Abacassis for Formula 2 races. The car was powered by a 2-litre, 4-cylinder, unsupercharged Alta with twin-choke carburetors. The engine developed 150 horsepower, giving the HWM a top speed of 140 miles per hour, far less than its Italian competitors. 37 years on, Sterling Moss is reunited with the HWM.
No, it's about the right colour, but the seat is a lot better than I had, I'll tell you that. We didn't have a seat like that. Can I jump in?
The HWM gave Sterling his introduction to Grand Prix racing, but the car wasn't really competitive.
They were uncompetitive because there was no money. I mean, John Heath, who was the man who was responsible for this, he had to take bits and pieces from other cars. I mean, this was a real bitzer. You know, the steering wheel came off one car and the front suspension came off, I think it was standard Vanguard, and the stub axles from another place. The wheels he did buy. The wheels were Italian special racing wheels, and the brake drums were special, Alfin. But again, they came as a special bit, and he assembled everything together to make a racing car. We used to get starting money for each race, which was then £200, which was not bad. We only raced every other week, roughly, in different places, Sable d'Olonne, Périgueux, Meta, you know, all over Europe. And John gave me 25%, so it's £50 every 2 weeks, which was £25 a week, which meant if I travelled with him in his Citroën and only ate the main dish of lunch and then stopped and bought fruit on the way, you know, I could make it work. And that was part of the fun of it, you know, I mean... you know, I didn't have money to spend. I mean, I didn't drink wine or anything like that. I mean, a big Coke mineral water or something. But that was what racing was. And at that rate, I could just about keep going. Then occasionally we would win a race at Goodwood, or we'd get a third or fourth. And then obviously I'd get 25%. Then the next year, I said to John, I think I've been with you, Neil, to give me a race. I got up to 33%. A third of what we took, of the takings, not just starting money. And of course, as I was young, we're talking 19 years old, people read the name, and so that was benefit to me. And then obviously you go around waving at people, and then the next year they'd say, my gosh, he's popular, we'd better pay him a bit more. So the more people you could get to wave at you, the more the local people, organisers, thought that you were worth for the following year. And then you go out from, shall we say, 200 to 350 maybe.
In 1951, Formula 2, in which Stirling had been racing the HWM, was about to be upgraded. The 1.5-litre Ferraris, despite having the champion driver Alberto Ascari, had been unable to defeat the Alfas. Apart from this rare Ferrari win at Silverstone when, in the absence of the Alfa team, Ascari literally took the flag. Enzo Ferrari Wright and his team manager Ugolini had noted that the relatively slow 4.5-litre unsupercharged French Lago Talbot often picked up places, simply because the economical big engines returned 10 miles to the gallon and did not therefore require as many fuel stops as the Alfa. During the winter of 1950, Ferrari's designer Lampredi developed a V12 4.5-litre unsupercharged engine for 1951, and a big man to drive the big car, Froilán González from Argentina. BRM drivers Reg Parnell and Peter Walker viewed the new Ferraris with mixed feelings at the British Grand Prix. Could the British cars actually beat the Italian Alfas and the new untried Ferraris? The newsreel was patriotic to a fault.
BRM's Parnell, number 6, were watched with keen satisfaction by Earl Howe and Raymond Mays. And there goes Walker, number 7. On their performance in this race, the BRM's future possibly defended. In spite of burns, their drivers carried on magnificently. Number 2, driven by Fangio, is one of the Alfas, and Alfas have a habit of winning, though not today. Victory was destined for González, number 12, in a Ferrari.
The Alfas are carrying nearly 70 gallons of fuel, but still need frequent pit stops for more, a total of 200 gallons, while the big Ferraris forge ahead. Parnell's BRM too refuels. He will finish 5th, Walker 7th. The only places ever to be gained in a Grand Prix by these BRMs.
But there goes González in a terrific spurt to win the race at an average speed of 96.11 miles an hour.
At last, the supercharged Alfetas have been defeated. The Ferrari team are ecstatic. Fangio congratulates his fellow Argentinian González. Sadly, it was the end of the road for Alfa Romeo, who withdrew from Grand Prix racing. They retired with honour. The 12 158 cars had, between 1947 and 1951, scored 31 victories in 35 starts, a record which remains to be equalled. The end of the Alfa team was the virtual end of Formula One. BRMs having failed, Ferrari had no opponents. So the BRMs, which cost £200,000, had to run in Formula League. In this race at Dundrod, Stirling Moss was left on the line, but got his BRM going. But both BRMs retired, beaten by Mike Hawthorne's £2,000 Formula 2 Cooper Bristol. much to the disgust of the young Stirling Moss.
I have driven and raced, I think, something over 80 cars in my life, and that was without doubt the worst car I ever sat in. I spent a lot of time with it in Monza. It was enormously powerful, of course, 570 horsepower, but the suspension, the steering, everything was really bad. It was a disgrace.
Why, with ample money available, were BRMs unable even to challenge the Italians? BRM chronicler Rivers Fletcher.
Well, the original BRM, the V16, was a fabulous idea, but I'm afraid the project was beyond the facility. It was a very complicated car, potentially the fastest and the most powerful Grand Prix car of its time, and in fact it proved to be about the fastest and the most powerful, but not sufficiently reliable.
So Stirling Moss drove a Cooper Alta, and the ebullient Mike Hawthorne was signed by Ferrari. By then, 1953, all Grand Prix races were to Formula 2. Moss is relaxed on the Cooper Alta, which is underpowered. Hawthorne is driving his Ferrari aggressively. Despite his more polished style, Moss can make no impression. Hawthorne never looked polished, but he won the Silverstone race at 92 miles per hour. It has to be said that there was little love lost between the two young English drivers.
Well, I'm very pleased, of course, and I think we ought to congratulate Stirling on driving today after his fantastic crash on first day's practice. Very lucky man. And
young men of Hawthorne and Moss's generation only just missed flying the fighters of World War II. Grand Prix driving in the 1950s required the same courage and skill. Witness Hawthorne after striking oil. This 1953 Formula 2 race has the new 250F Maserati, driven by Gonzalez, now known in the British press as the Wild Bull of the Pampas. Hawthorne's Ferrari passed by the Maserati of Fangio. But ahead of all, Ascari drives his 2-litre Ferrari to yet another victory, having lapped the field, bar Fangio. At the end of the 1953 season, the old Formula One was officially abandoned, and a new Formula One for unsupercharged cars of 2.5 litres was decided on. Thus, constructors could enlarge the existing simple 4-cylinder 2-litre engines, helping small concerns like the British Connaught. John Watson tested a 1954 Formula 1 2.5-litre Connaught, which was to give Britain its first Grand Prix win since 1924.
I'll talk you through the gauges while you're doing that.
Okay.
The engine, you'll probably only get about 50 or 60 degrees on a day like this. Engine pressure will run between 80 and 100 pounds. Fuel pressure would normally run at 6 pounds. Water temperature should run no more than 80, and the gearbox pressure for the pre-selector will fluctuate between 20 and 60 pounds.
The ticking is the electric fuel pump, but no self-starter is fitted.
Because it doesn't have maybe the extreme of power, you tend to feel that the handling is maybe greater than it is, but certainly in its form, it's comfortable to drive. You're not embarrassed by any power in a corner or an accelerating out of a corner. In the Connaught, you are very much between the wheels, and which of course is what we see in contemporary Formula One these days. I think it's a significant car, a make of car that has not really received its recognition, mainly because it was on a very limited budget and the team were not able to go to the length that the European teams were able to do in the early 50s and middle 50s. But its contribution, I think, is important, and it's probably been very understated, in fact, by history. You know, the Connaught, I think its only power was the factor that prevented it from being, you know, the first successful post-war Grand Prix car.
But the competition from Italy would still be formidable, for Ferrari too will develop a car for 1954. But as the old season drew to its close and drivers swapped lies about their firm's intentions for the new formula, a faint shadow was cast. For Phoenix-like, a star had risen in the east, a three-pointed star. The Germans were coming back.